This is the Mobile Tech Podcast, brought to you by worldpodcasts.com. Now here's your host, Tech Girl, Miriam Joire.
Hi, and welcome to the Mobile Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Miriam Joire, and today is Wednesday, February 12th, 2020. We're the day after Samsung Unpacked, and my guest is Chris Davies of SlashGear. Hi, Chris. How are you?
Hey, Miriam. I'm very good. How are you?
I'm great. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I know it's a busy week for all of us, so thanks for that.
Always a pleasure.
Wonderful. So you've had a little bit more interaction with the Samsung products than I have. I went to Unpacked. I tweeted like a storm. It was wonderful during the show. And then afterwards, I got a brief amount of time in the hands-on area with the harsh lights. And I've got a couple of YouTube videos that are going to be published by the time people listen to this show. But you were pre-briefed, so you got a chance to get a little more information. And that's kind of why I wanted you on the show, or at least somebody that had some insight on some of the crazy technology, especially around the cameras and around the 5G stuff. Because the thing that blew me away the most, I didn't actually know from the rumors, it hadn't really sunk into me, that we would see 3 phones with 5G that would support 5G for all carriers. But it turns out there's a caveat, right? So let's talk about that in due time.
Yes.
I want to know what you think of the Galaxy Z or Z Flip before we do anything else. Let's talk about that one.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, obviously, you can't really talk about foldable phones without mentioning that Samsung's first attempt did not exactly go to plan when they initially launched it early last year. But then they came back and they'd redesigned parts of it, and it has, by all rights and intents, been a lot more successful, albeit still very niche because it is hugely expensive. And so this kind of feels like Samsung has taken away a lot of the learnings that they had from that whole fold debacle and put it into something which is, whilst not mass market ready, because it's still like $1,400, but definitely something closer to that point.
I think you're right. I felt very much like this is a Gen 2 product with the level of polish you expect from a Gen 2 product. But I think the price is kind of a non-issue. And I tell you my theory behind that. At least in North America, it's all subsidized these days, right? I mean, the reality is I want to advocate for people to buy unlocked phones. Absolutely. And I think the mid-range and even the $300 phone, and I want to say the mid-range today, I mean the OnePlus, the $500 range, the affordable flagship range is what I call it. But even the $300 range, I think it has some very interesting products, but nobody's buying them. Or at least if you talk to Timo, for example, who carries OnePlus, they are focused primarily on the really high-end OnePlus products because they found that they're just not selling the cheaper ones as much. And so I think this is the subsidy effect. I think that if you buy a phone on contract and you have to pay, it's about $1,000 normally, and you have to pay, say, $40 a month, but now it's $50 a month, 2 more espressos, as it were. Why would you care if it's $1,400 retail at that point? You know what I'm saying?
I think, that's definitely a good point. I think the US market in particular is still very much wedded to this idea of a subsidized device. I think maybe because traditionally perhaps the devices on one carrier haven't necessarily worked with a different carrier, and so there's been this feeling that you buy into not just the phone but the carrier, and you're sticking with that, and it's you just do it all through that one carrier. So yeah, I think you're probably right, and I think that this will definitely ease the way into foldable ownership, especially seeing as Samsung definitely is pushing the Z Flip a lot more, it would seem, than it did with the Fold. The Fold was kind of like a halo device. The Z Flip, they're really trying to get it out there and position it as like, this is just the next thing and you want to be in on this early.
Yeah. And I also feel that their demographic is much broader this time around, right? The Fold was really like early adopter, tech savvy, heavy phone, big phone, even Fold, it was big and heavy. And, we're not quite sure, like, it's kind of like the first note, remember? We're going to throw this dart at the wall and hope it hits the target a little bit and see what develops from it. And we've all seen that, I think I mentioned this on a podcast recently, but there was a review on Ars Technica of the Fold from Ron Amadeo, and it was very damning. But he had a really good point, and I feel it's like even if you open up the Fold and you try to use it as a tablet, it's not really a good use case because Android doesn't do tablet mode very well, right?
Right.
So I feel this form factor, which is basically the Razer Death Ray, is what I'm going to call the Z Flip now, because it's like I feel bad for Moto almost because this is much better, cheaper, and it seems to have the clout of the marketing machine behind Samsung. So,
absolutely,
how do you feel first of all as about the product? Purely in the Samsung ecosystem as the second foldable that is not a tablet when it's open, but it's just a phone when it's open, versus the greater scheme of it, which is like, how does it fit into the ecosystem of the entire mobile universe?
Well, I think it's quite interesting that already, even in what is still a very kind of new segment of foldable devices, that we do have like two different strategies there. On the one hand, you do have, like you say, the original Fold, which was it is a phone that unfolds to a small tablet. And then on the other hand, you have phones like the Razer, like the new Z Flip, which are regular sized phones when they're open that we are kind of familiar with, but then that close down to something much more pocket friendly. And I feel like the latter is a lot easier to understand, maybe.
Yes.
Because people want a big screen, and once you try a big screen, it's very rare that you then decide, well, I'm going to go back to something smaller. If you've experienced that kind of 6+ inches, then it's kind of like it's hard to then say, well, okay, I'm going to go back to something more like 5 inches or 5.5. People generally don't do it, and just speaking personally, once I started going to those larger screen devices, suddenly I stopped using the tablets I had, and
exactly.
The few times that I go to pick one up, the battery's dead because I just haven't used it. So I use it so infrequently that it just becomes something that just sits on a coffee table gathering dust and getting covered with magazines.
My NVIDIA Shield was the first big victim for me.
Yes.
I had one, I used it a lot, and then I got a big phone. It was just like that tipping point, and then I stopped using it.
Absolutely. And so I think that there is that. Whilst the idea of a phone that opens up into a tablet is definitely appealing to some people, like you say, like that Ars Technica review said, Android as a tablet operating system isn't great, and so it's a lot easier to kind of pitch this idea of, well, we have a phone which is all the things you like about a big screen S20, but can close down and suddenly become something which is a lot more sort of user-friendly in terms of, the times when you're not actually using the phone, you just put it in your pocket, into your bag, into a small purse. I think that makes a lot more sense, and it's a lot easier to pitch that.
Yeah, I feel like the demographic is interesting here because there's going to be still the tech-savvy early adopters, right? Because we're like, oh, this might be the right fold, the first properly done folding phone, right? And then I think that they're kind of, with some of the features we're going to discuss, they're really kind of putting it in a more mainstream kind of vibe. And then because, as you said, it's more accessible because it's really just a phone that folds in half, not something that's trying to be a tablet in its spare time.
Right.
And on top of that, I feel like, I hate to say this as a woman in tech, but I really feel like I didn't really want to buy this thing in terms of the argument of this looks like a compact. But now that I've used it, I'm sorry to say this looks like a compact, and but it's got this really good vibe to it. Like I felt like it had a Samsungness to it, but also a bit of an Appleness to it in its industrial design and vibe. Like the round rect, the aspects of it is much more Apple than Samsung. But of course, that weird Samsung logo on the hinge is very Samsung-y, and then. And then, yes, it does open and close a lot like a compact. The biggest thing for me that stood out was that the hinge can be opened at any angle. And there's a lot of features that come along with that. So it's not like the Razer where the idea is that you flip it open, you flip it closed, and it's spring-loaded, and it's very much the same experience you had with a flip phone. This is more like a laptop in many ways. The mechanism, the hinge, the feel of it. And then it doesn't close perfectly flat. There is a gap, but it's much less pronounced than on the Fold was, and a bit more pronounced than the Razer, which it's not supposed to have a gap, but actually most of the ones I've played with have a tiny gap.
They do.
So that's to me kind of like the takeaway on the design. And I think that what really got me excited is that this is a thin layer of glass on top of the plastic OLED that folds. How the hell is that possible? Did they tell you anything about this?
They have been playing that whole thing very close to their chest, and it does seem fairly magical. But I think that is part of the reason that it feels like we're taking another big step closer to the mainstream, because I've lived with a Fold, and there is that kind of fear of the plastic OLED breaking. Obviously this is something that they had issues with to begin with. They took it away, they came back. But the nature of a plastic display is that when you first open it up, there's a warning there saying, maybe don't use your fingernail too hard on this. And you're like, well, I've just spent $2,000 on a phone. Should I have to worry about that?
Yeah, right.
And just that feeling of going and then to the Z Flip, and you open it up and it kind of just feels like a regular phone display because of that glass.
When you touch it's very different. I noticed it right away, even though I didn't get a Fold myself. I've played with enough of them. Mm-hmm. And just recently I was in Chicago, so I got to play with the Razer again at Moto, and it's immediately noticeable, but it still flexes, but not in this packing tape way.
Yes.
It flexes more in this plastic cup way. Like what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's a very hard thing to describe, but it just gives you that feeling of this is a little bit more resilient. This is going to last. This is going to kind of hold up to daily life, which I think that neither the Fold nor the Razer kind of give that sort of sense of reassurance.
And it does have a crease. It's very obvious that there is a disturbance in the optical force.
Yes.
In the middle of that display. But I don't think it bothers me as much. It's interesting that the Razer doesn't have that, at least as pronounced on the units I've seen. I don't know, after 6 months it might have it. But Samsung doesn't seem to make any excuses about it. They're like, we're just going to do this. It's going to be part of the design. And what I think it is, as this is my engineer kind of backfiring in the back of my head, but my engineer self says that they probably, if it's folding glass, if it's what Corning's been working on, mm-hmm. or someone else, it is pre-stressed glass. So it probably, the creases we're seeing are the pre-designed curves in the glass that are kind of the default position, if you want, right? And that's what we're seeing, unlike before, where in the plastic, what we're seeing is just generally natural wear of the creases of the plastic.
I feel like that, whilst I understand people's kind of obsession with that crease, I don't kind of have any real concern with it myself. I feel like if you are using a foldable phone, then, there is probably going to be some evidence of where the fold is. My concern would only ever be, does that feel sturdy and resilient enough to kind of last? So I don't know, maybe somewhere down the line we will have foldable displays that don't have a crease at all, but it's kind of not really near the top of my must-have list to kind of do away with that.
It didn't bother me at all when I was using it. It seems less pronounced than on the Fold and definitely more visible than on the Razer, but I'd rather have a glass layer here that I know is, going to be feeling better on my finger. Is really that's the first thing that I felt. I guess this is, if we had to summarize the description of how it feels feels a lot more like a normal phone when you touch it, and a lot less like a piece of paper.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that part of the reason that people are concerned about the crease is that it gives you this fear that this is going to be the point where it will fail. And I think that the knowledge that the glass is there maybe kind of means that you're saying, okay, well, the crease is there, but there's glass here, so it's kind of less of an issue there. I'm less concerned that failure is just around the corner.
And they put some fabric brushes inside the hinge to brush out any or prevent any particles from getting inside it, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, just that whole anything with moving parts, obviously is going to present a challenge, because moving parts are extra points of potential damage, extra points where something could break. There is a reason that kind of phones have all coalesced around this sealed, waterproofed candy bar, no headphone jack, so that it makes it easier to seal up again, no removable battery.
Yeah.
manufacturers like simple designs that don't have moving parts. And so, yeah, I think that we are still very much in that kind of exploratory phase with hinges. But yeah, I think it's really exciting. And I think that one of the things I liked about it was that it kind of embraces that hinge in a way with the software. You know, when, like you were saying, that you can adjust the hinge to kind of, it will hold at any angle like a laptop lid.
Right.
When you open up the Razr, you just get like a full screen Android experience. It looks like a big screen Android phone. With the Z Flip, you know, if you open it part way and you're using the camera, for instance, you know, and you prop it up at the screen halfway, then the camera UI sort of slides around almost like liquid, kind of just settling into a different layout, so that you have the preview display at the top and a control panel at the bottom. And there's something nice about the way it does that kind of encompasses the hinge and says, you know, this is a foldable device, so we can do things slightly differently there.
Yeah, and it looks like they worked with Google on some stuff, because YouTube is supported in that mode. So just to explain a little bit more for the audience, if you put it in an L shape, like a perfect right angle, I mean, you don't have to be at a perfect right angle, but in that general vicinity, if you put the phone down with the bottom flat and the other half sticking up, you basically can do time lapses with the camera. Like, you use it as a tripod as such, because the dual camera, which is on the lid, is now facing backwards. You can also use it for selfies, because the front camera is facing you. Mm-hmm. And you, as you said, the viewfinder becomes square, and the part that's on the table, basically, the flat part is going to be the controls. And then they have the same for YouTube, so you can actually watch YouTube videos like this if you want. Use the phone as a kickstand, basically, by halving the screen size, and essentially. So it's a small video. It's basically like watching portrait mode, YouTube landscape videos in portrait mode. But I think for a lot of content nowadays, which is square or vertical, I think it's going to work pretty well. Especially for, folks who are constantly on Snapchat or Instagram stories or Facebook stories, which I think a lot of people are. So I think it's interesting. It's very novel that they came up with this idea. And then I think that what I like too was that the outside display is really small. It's a 1-inch AMOLED color, but they're, unlike Moto, they didn't really like push this idea of the external screen too much. They're like, yes, you can accept and refuse calls, you can tell the time, you can see who's calling, you can have notifications pop up, but we don't expect you to interact with this very much, right?
Right, and I think that it's this is something that you're obviously going to be opening and closing a lot, because that external display, a text can come in and it will scroll across like a ticker tape, but you're not going to want to like read an entire long-winded message on that tiny external display.
There's no way you're going to do anything on
it. So it really is just a, I have something coming in, and it's to let you know what it's going to be before you open it up. I think people are going to definitely be opening and closing that a lot.
But I think just like the Razr, this is going to be a difficult phone to open one-handed. And that's going to be a challenge for a lot of people, because, if you're walking down the street and your phone vibrates in your handbag, and you're trying to reach in there, you get the phone, no problem. You can find that with your hand without looking. But at that point, you now have to probably stop walking, use both hands to open it, because I tried one-handed a few times and I would drop that thing in 2 seconds flat.
You can definitely do it, but it is not, if you're expecting like a flip phone, like, the old Razr days where, you just slip your finger, a thumbnail in and kind of just flip it open. You use the inertia
of your hand, right? Like, clunk.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen.
It does not work like that. And so you can open it and you can close it one-handed, but it is not the most ergonomic of things to do. No.
And I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed by the manufacturers, because Moto has the same issue with the Razr. It doesn't open and close like you expect a Razr to open and close. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a bit of a bummer, honestly. But hey, I mean, that's the price of progress, I guess.
I suppose so. Maybe they shouldn't have called it a flip, because the flip does make you think that you can just flip it open, whereas really it's a prizing opener. They should have called it the Z Oyster or something. And
Z is interesting too, because I feel like it's more of an L or
a V
a V. So I guess the Z line is a whole new line.
I think it's supposed to be a nod to Generation Z.
I see. Okay, interesting. Yeah.
Young people.
young people today,
They're the
Chris.
worst.
Oh my
Don't
goodness.
get me started.
I know.
Yeah. I'm going to go up and shout at a cloud. Yeah,
I know. We should do that over coffee, and then we can weep in our coffee like we always
weeping,
do.
Absolutely, just constant weeping at
and
clouds.
just like brandish our canes into the sky. Boy. Okay, so the other couple of things that I think I wanted to touch on is that there is a SIM slot and an eSIM on the Z Fold. I'm sorry, I'm gonna say Z. I know some people are gonna say Z. Because I'm Canadian, I could say either, really. But I think the Z Fold is interesting because it beats Moto on so many layers in some ways, technically speaking, right? And that's kind of what I think is interesting, that, you can tell Moto's design has been in the works for way longer.
I think that, there was a sense when Motorola announced the Razr of, okay, well, there are some hardware compromises, it's eSIM only, the battery isn't huge, the camera isn't great, the processor isn't like the fastest flagship one. But it was almost a sense of, well, okay, this is just what is possible with a foldable form factor that is that kind of size. If you want a large, regular screen phone that folds down into something which is half the size of that, then I guess this is the compromise that the current level of technology is that we, and we will just have to accept that. And then all of a sudden Samsung comes along and says, well, no, hang on, we can fit in a regular SIM slot and eSIM. We can put a much more impressive processor in there. We can give you dual cameras on the front. It's a real, Motorola, I think, they had that opportunity, a very narrow window, which then narrowed even further because they delayed the launch of the handset, and it's very hard to imagine telling someone, yes, you should go for that Razr over the Samsung.
I feel that Moto's issue here, I mean, there's, Moto PR is running into some issues and challenges with the Razr launch. I don't know exactly why. They were so gung-ho in November when we saw the product hands-on. And then now that it's launching, it's impossible to get a review unit. And, Samsung PR has also been very challenging over the years, and I'm sure it's going to be really hard to get a Z Flip review unit for those of us who are not, the Engadgets and Verges and CNETs of the world. But I think it's interesting to me that you can kind of tell the age of these phones. You can carbon date these phones almost by the spec sheet, right? Like, you can tell that the Z Flip was in development a year ago and, finalized in the fall, and it's out now. Whereas the Razr was in development 2 years ago, finalized in the fall. Because as you said, specs, right? Like, by all practical measures, the Z Flip is a Galaxy S10e, right?
Yes.
With a Snapdragon 855 Plus instead of regular 855, 8 gigs of RAM, 256 gigs of storage. We've got cameras. Oh yeah, they're dual 12 megapixels, just like the S10e. That's why I brought it up. There's a main camera that's just the regular, and then there is a ultra wide. And so that's actually really nice because Samsung cameras are pretty decent on the S10 series. And now you're getting that on a flip phone. As we know, the Razr's camera just doesn't really live up to that. So
no. It's, I think I like that there is that lack of compromise. If you want a foldable phone, you don't have to then sacrifice on the features. It doesn't have to feel like a phone with the specs of a device from 2 years ago or whatever.
Yeah, and also, like the battery size, 3,300 milliamp hours, that's standard fare for a small flagship from 2019, right?
Yeah.
It's on the small size, but still manageable.
I think, if you compare it to the S20, which starts out with a 4,000 milliamp hour battery, which, is obviously significantly bigger. But, that has 5G, which the Z Flip doesn't.
Exactly.
So, 5G is going to be more power demanding.
For sure. And it's a good point to make that it doesn't have 5G. But I'm glad to see it has a SIM slot because I feel like, Moto's mistakes for the last few years is being that they are always in bed with Verizon. And I understand that long-term relationship and partnership they've had, but it's a hindrance at this point more than anything else. I feel like not putting a SIM slot on the Razr was partially dictated by lack of space, but partially probably dictated by Verizon. Let's make this very difficult to use on another network. Because I asked them about how to provision the eSIM on that phone. If you're not on Verizon, if you buy it up front on Verizon, you wait the 60 days for it to unlock, and then you decide to put it on T-Mobile, which, as you know, provisions eSIMs all the time.
Yeah.
They basically told me that, well, it doesn't support the right bands anyway, so it's not going to work. And I'm like, wow. Like, this is a Qualcomm chip, folks. Like, this is just weird to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it really just narrows down the audience, the potential audience for the Razr. You know, you have to be someone with the budget. You have to be someone who likes the form factor. You have to be someone who is willing to kind of deal with the compromises of a cutting edge phone. And then you have to be someone who is willing to commit to Verizon. And
that's a tough one. So do we know what networks the Z Flip is going to be sold in the US?
I don't know if they've confirmed that. I believe it just has all of the general bands.
So it's just unlocked, basically.
I think that, you know, Samsung will be offering an unlocked version. There will be carrier versions, and they are just doing the normal Samsung thing of going for as many markets as possible, I think.
And that's kind of smart, I think. You know, I like it. I'm happy about that. The selfie camera is 10 megapixels, basically also the same thing as a S10 series. So basically it's an S10 in many ways with a folding display. It's a 6.7 inch display though, 21:9 aspect ratio. So it's a pretty tall, narrow.
Tall and thin, yes.
And it looks great. It's AMOLED in all the ways that Samsung makes gorgeous displays. Probably not as good as the Note series or the S20, which we're about to talk about, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it checks off a lot of the boxes that people have been waiting for to think, well, is this something that I'd like to maybe get into? You know, is it time to consider a foldable? And I think that there are still going to be plenty of people who will decide, no, you know, let's see what 2021 brings. But I think for the people who make this their first foldable experience, I think they're going to be, you know, from my relatively limited time with it, I think they're going to be happy.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I feel very good about it. But then again, I did feel pretty good about the Razr when I first saw it. And now, you know, we've seen the initial launch. It hasn't gone quite as planned. So let's keep our fingers crossed. I want people to have form factor choices. I want this folding stuff to go away simply because the first few launches are perilous, you know?
Right.
So I'm rooting for everyone here. I just want everyone to know, Moto, Samsung, keep at it. Others come into the fray and party with us.
Yes, exactly.
Let's talk about the S20 line. Let's maybe quickly bullet point the common features. I mostly want to focus on the S20 Ultra for the cameras, but I also want to start, before we even talk about the specifics on the three phones, I want to talk about something that you wrote about because you probably have more to share with us. It's the 5G story. To me, what kind of blew my mind, and intuitively I knew this would eventually happen, but I didn't think it was going to be the S20, was that this is the first phone, at least in the US, that's 5G across the board. And I thought it was all bands 5G, like millimeter, mid-band, low band on all three, but it turns out it's actually only millimeter wave on some of the phones. So still, I don't want to be negative about it. I think this is really exciting. I think 5G is a big deal, especially when you use low band. And millimeter wave is, of course, very spectacular, but I don't think it's the story. I think the story of 5G, after having used a low band phone, the McLaren Edition 1 Plus on T-Mobile for a while, is all about low band and how it's a turbo boost on top of LTE. And it makes a difference because you get better coverage and better performance in places you couldn't use your phone before.
Right. So at launch, all three will have 5G and they'll all have sub-6, so the low band support. Only the S20 Plus 5G and the S20 Ultra will have the millimeter wave support. So, but then coming on like maybe next quarter, there will be a new version of the S20 which will have millimeter wave support, apparently. So, and that's going to shape how, you know, the carriers and which phones they offer. So I believe that Verizon will not be offering the S20 to begin with because it won't have the millimeter wave support that they've been pushing so hard, and which gives them such, you know, fast 5G speeds. So you'll be able to buy the S20 Plus and the S20 Ultra from Verizon. And if you had an S20 that was unlocked that you bought from Samsung Direct, it would work on Verizon's network, but only in their sub-6 markets.
Once they get that on their network, right?
So I think it's going to be a little bit confusing to begin with. But I think if you are a carrier customer who is going in to upgrade, you will be guided to the choice which makes the most sense for your network, because they will not sell you a device which doesn't make the most of the 5G offering that they currently have.
Did you get a sense from talking to them about this that the versions, if you were to get them unlocked, are identical SKUs across carriers? As in, if you buy a T-Mobile version and you get it unlocked, you can then take it to Verizon and the bands are there.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
That is a feat of engineering.
It really is. And I think that, we took for granted at sort of the tail end of the 4G LTE era that, one device would work across networks. We've kind of gotten away from this idea of there is a different version of this phone that you need to make sure, check the model number and say, exactly which bands are supported. And then all of a sudden 5G came along and it was like, oh no, reset on that. You have to make sure that you have the Verizon one that will work or the T-Mobile one. So yeah, I think that, Samsung and Qualcomm, deserve a lot of credit for taking away some of that confusion. And I think that we are very much clearly at the bleeding edge of that, because, with this issue with the S20, when it first launches, not having millimeter wave and that being corrected, not long after. So yeah, it will be complicated, but it will also be fairly straightforward. So I don't think it's something that people need to worry about. But, I think that for a lot of people, even, it doesn't really matter what 5G their phone will support, because, a lot of
they're
people
just going to buy
not
from the operator directly anyway.
They'll buy it from the operator, and if they are lucky, they live in an area where there is 5G coverage. But I think for most people, that is still not the case.
Indeed. So about unlocked versions, did you get any information on that? Is there going to be an unlocked version of the 5G phones?
Yes, there will.
Okay.
So you will be able to just buy a 5G phone direct from Samsung, or the usual resellers, and you will be able to just activate it on the network of your choice.
Wow, this is very cool. This is a first. This is a big deal.
It is, and I think that it kind of takes a big company like Samsung or an Apple, presumably later in the year, to do that. It's a lot of effort.
I mean, I want to say at this point, seeing how things have evolved in the last 6 months, if there is any doubt in anybody's mind that Apple is not going to launch an iPhone with 5G, you're sadly mistaken. Apple cannot not launch a phone without 5G right now.
Yes, and I think that, by the time it comes to the normal new iPhone cycle later on in the year, it will just be, the networks will have had time to, do some further maturing, and people will kind of have a better idea of what to expect from 5G, and the carriers will be better equipped to handle it, and it will just, I think Apple will get to reap the rewards of
this. Yeah.
Of the Android devices kind of paving the way at that kind of somewhat awkward initial moment of 5G's debut.
We are the awkward early adopters and tech savvy.
Someone has to be.
I know. So let's talk about quickly the specs and commonalities. All three phones have 120 hertz displays. That's a big deal as well, right?
120 hertz, yeah, but not at the maximum resolution.
I did not know that. So you have to step down to 1080p for that?
I believe so. I would need to double check on the, but yeah, I don't think it works at the very full resolution. There is a compromise there.
That's all right. I can live with 1080p. Are all three displays 2K? I couldn't figure that out yesterday.
I believe so, yes.
That is amazing, because the smaller S20 is a 6.2 inch display. 2K at 6.2 inch is a lot of resolution. I mean, I know we've had phones with smaller displays than that at 2K in the past, but I'm still amazed by that, because the S10e last year was a 1080p display, right?
That's right. Yeah. They all of the displays this year, they all look tremendous. I mean, they Samsung is known for its amazing AMOLED panels, and this is no exception.
But they're no longer waterfall edges or curved edges, or very slightly.
Yeah, and I think that previously Samsung has felt obliged to offer both, like a waterfall edge and a flat edge in some,
depending on the model,
in some way. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this way it just allows them to kind of standardize on it, and the waterfall edge, it looks nice.
I don't like
it, but actually usability wise, yeah, it doesn't really bring much.
But it's a big step for Samsung to change that. That's one of their brand signifiers, right? At least since the S6 anyway. So
yeah, I think that there is enough of a curve there that people will recognize it as you're not going to look at these phones and mistake them for any other company's
They're
devices.
very Samsung-y.
Yes.
Yeah. And then in terms of, let's see, I'm trying to think of other commonalities. No headphone jack.
No headphone jack.
Wireless charging and water resistance across the board.
Yep.
Do they all support reverse wireless charging? I think they do. Yeah.
Yes.
What else do we got that's common? I think that's it. Then we have battery sizes. So 4,000, 4,500, and 5,000 milliamp hour for the S20, S20 Plus, S20 Ultra, right?
Yep. That's right.
Screen size is a 6.2 inch, as I mentioned, for the S20, 6.7 inch for the S20 Plus, 6.9 inch for the S20 Ultra. Commonalities: Snapdragon 865 or some sort of Exynos chip across the board.
That's right. So if you're in the US, it will be the Snapdragon 865.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then RAM is 12 gigabytes of RAM on all three models, with up to 16 on the Ultra.
Yes, and 128 gigabytes across all of them, but the S20 Plus and the Ultra will offer 512 gigabyte versions as well.
All right. So the two top ones offering 512. Interesting. No 256, you said?
No, it goes straight to 512. But you get them, and all three have a micro SD slot, which will take
a terabyte.
A terabyte card.
I love how on stage they went like 1.5 terabytes. I'm like, only with a micro SD card, guys. Come on. Yeah. That's a little much, but yeah, that's really exciting though. I mean, this is some powerhouse devices. Let's talk about the camera, since that's always a big distinguishing feature, and I want to spend a bit more emphasis on the Ultra. So they all have multiple cameras. The S20 has triple camera system. The S20 Plus is quad camera. I'm talking about the rear cameras here, and the S20 Ultra also had quad rear cameras. And we're going to talk about the Ultra separately, but let's talk about the S20 real quick. The 20 and 20 Plus both have a 10 megapixel front-facing camera, which looks like to me it's about the same as it's always been for Samsung for the last couple of generations, right?
Right.
You can't complain about that camera. It's pretty competent.
Yes.
Then in the back, the S20 has a set of 12 megapixel cameras for the ultra wide and the 3x optical zoom. And then it has a 64 megapixel camera, the Samsung sensor that's been on other phones, for its main camera, right?
Right. So so they use they use a digital sensor crop for the lossless zoom.
Do they?
Yeah, it's not an optical telephoto. So the S20 and the S20 Plus, the zoom camera is actually 64 megapixels, but it will produce 12 megapixel stills.
12 megapixel stills.
Yes.
So they have a dedicated 64 megapixel sensor that crops.
Yes. So it means that they can do a 3x optical equivalent lossless zoom, or a 30 times sort of hybrid optic zoom using AI.
Interesting. Do they have OIS on the zoom and the main lens? I couldn't find any information about that.
They are being cagey about that, so it is not entirely clear at this point. It
might be digital, because if they're using 64 megapixel sensor, they have a ton of room to do digital real-time cropping, right?
Right.
So at least for the tele, so if they're using 64 as a digital crop to 12, they can crop that and move that window around extensively and get some pretty good stabilization using digital. It's interesting though. That means that you probably won't get that great of a light performance out of the telephoto, right?
Yeah. So I'm just double checking with the specs now. They are saying it has OIS for both the wide angle and the telephoto.
Oh well, then we go there.
Yeah.
Oh wow, and that's for both the S20 and S20 Plus then.
Yes.
Basically, the S20 Plus just has a depth sensor added to the party, right, in the back.
Yeah. Though, interestingly, that's only used apparently for augmented reality apps.
Oh, it's not even used for focusing or anything like that?
No, it's in the Ultra, it's used for focusing as well.
So let's talk about the Ultra in a minute, but I want to just kind of wrap my head around it. So let's summarize for the S20, S20 Plus. Other than the depth sensing camera, which is on the S20 Plus, do you know if they are using any kind of tricks like multiple cameras at the same time to get better low light performance on the telephoto, for example, using some data from the main sensor?
All they will say is that they are using some mixture of, the cameras will do their kind of own thing in the background. But there's no kind of real specificity there as to what, how that's being used.
And no specifics on macro modes or anything like that, right?
No,
okay.
No.
Well, it should be interesting. I'm positively optimistic, but I'm mostly excited about the Ultra because the Ultra is a whole different beast, right?
It is.
So we have 3 sensors. I think I understand this a little better. I don't know about OIS, but maybe you can fill me in if you have the spec sheet. So for now, what I know is that we have a 108 megapixel main sensor that pixel bins 9:1. We talked about this on last show. I said it's got to be coming. 9:1 makes perfect sense because the final output 12 megapixels, right? You divide by 9, not by 3. And it's kind of a great technique. You're basically, instead of an array of 4 pixels, 2x2, you're doing an array of 3x3, so 9 pixels. And it was inevitable somebody would do this one day. So we're talking 108 megapixel, f of 1.8, main sensor that pixel bins 9:1, and that should be a beast. And then we have get this, 48 megapixel, 10 times optical periscope zoom lens. And I hope that thing has OIS on it if it zooms that much. It
does, but I think what's interesting is that the periscope lens actually is a 4 times. They're basically using a combination of pixel cropping on that lens and the lens
itself. So you
itself.
don't get the whole 48.
No, so
that makes sense actually.
Yeah, so it's a combination of that periscope lens and of the pixel cropping. So it's a 4 times optical zoom lens basically, and then the 48 megapixel sensor.
A lot, like By the way, OnePlus did that on the OnePlus 7 Pro.
They did.
They state that it's 3 times optical zoom, but it's really a 2 times optical zoom with some cropping on the sensor. So I'm not convinced this is a good idea, but we'll see. Computational photography is a thing, and it does magic. So let's see what they manage to pull off, especially with an 865 driving the show, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a 10 times lossless zoom is what they're promising, and I don't feel like most people like you are going to care about how they do that and how they deliver it. I feel like most people probably aren't really going to be bothered as to whether it's an optical thing or if it's a digital thing or what. They will just care that they can get closer and it looks good.
I agree. I'm just skeptical. I'm not saying it's not going to work. I want to embrace computational photography 100%. Proof is in the pudding. Then there's a third lens, of course, which is the 12 megapixel ultra wide. That's very much the same as the other S20s. And there's a depth sensor as well. But you're saying that they're using the depth sensor differently on the Ultra then?
So the depth sensor on the Ultra is used both for kind of augmented reality apps, but also to improve the autofocus.
That makes sense. That's good. I'm surprised they're not doing that on the S20 and S20 Plus. It seems, the 20 Plus, which has one, not the S20.
Yeah, there was no real reason given for why that was the case. It's just that's how they're doing it.
Maybe it's a cheaper depth sensor or something.
Could be. Yeah, that's another good question.
Did they tell you, or do you have any hard evidence that there's OIS on the telephoto and the main lens? I would assume there is.
Yes, both the main and the telephoto both have OIS, and they also use some AI stabilization as well for kind of like a hybrid system too.
Oh yeah, and you'd expect that. I think this is going to be an interesting camera system insofar that Sony has shown the way, right? The IMX586. 48 megapixel sensor that was on almost every phone last year that came out of China, and many mid-range phones that were really awesome, including the OnePlus 7T. And I shouldn't say mid-range, I should say affordable flagships at this point. But Oppo had them as well. A bunch of people had them. They performed really well when tuned properly. The best implementation, in my opinion, was the Honor 20 Pro last year. It kind of combined Huawei's imaging might with Sony's, impeccable IMX586 implementation into this ungodly performance. Definitely by a long shot the best 48 megapixel based camera I used last year. So I know it's possible to really refine that. I haven't, in my experience, been too impressed with the Samsung 48 and 64 megapixel sensors so far implemented by other people. But I haven't also played with a 108 because it's on a bunch of phones now. I think it's on an Oppo or a Vivo phone. at least, and
Yeah,
maybe
I
a
think a
Xiaomi
Vivo
phone.
Yes.
And I think it's going to come. We're going to see that sensor on a whole bunch of phones
Yes.
coming forward, because Samsung's probably going to sell it. And I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, Sony now has a 64 megapixel sensor. I can't remember what the number is, but I wouldn't be surprised if they follow suit. Because if you think about it, right, the idea behind 48 megapixel was 48 divided by 4 for pixel binning gives you, as you guessed it, 12. Right, 12 is the sweet spot for output, for storage, and for detail. And then 108 divided by 9 is 12. So, we're going to see more and more of those. That's what those numbers mean. It's because of the binning. And binning is absolutely a tremendous technique that Nokia, started. They started it with the 808 PureView. And,
all the way back.
And the Lumia 1020 all the way back. So.
Though it's interesting to note that you will be able to take 108 megapixel images.
Oh my God, you will. Wow.
Yes, so you can choose to set it to that if you want, or the camera will actually suggest, if it kind of based on the sort of the circumstances of the photo that you're taking, it will suggest switch to this mode and take a full 108 megapixel shot. Though, you're looking at anything.
Have some light to do that.
You would need some light, and you'll need to make sure you have plenty of storage too, because they're going to be like anywhere between 25 and 45 megabytes per file is what Samsung is predicting.
Now, the other big news, and I know this is not ultra specific, but it's across the board. I forgot it when we talked about it earlier, about the commonalities, is 8K video recording.
Yes.
Kids these days, Chris, I don't know. Like, I can barely wrap my head around 4K. I still record most of my videos on YouTube at 1080p. Get off my lawn.
I feel like I hear you. The one thing which makes me feel a lot more kind of excited about 8K video is the fact that you'll be able to take out a 33 megapixel still from it.
Oh, wow.
So whereas, as you know, if you try and take a photo in video mode at the moment with like a 1080p or a 4K phone, it doesn't look great. The resolution kind of, it's noticeably different from like just taking a regular photo on a phone. Whereas from an 8K video, you get this 33 megapixel photo. They're talking about this going to have, it has improved super steady stabilization now. So as well as sort of adjust, stabilizing up and down and left and right movements, it can deal with rolling movements from side to side up to 60 degrees.
Yeah. That's cool.
It's low light improvements is better for super steady mode. I think all of a sudden, when you're talking about kind of taking these things, video and photos kind of in tandem, then all of a sudden 8K starts to make a bit more sense to me.
No, I think it makes sense to me as well with the amount of storage I have on these phones. The fact that these phones have 5G, have gigabit Wi-Fi, all of that. And the fact that, the big push at CS this year was 8K TVs. Within a year or two, we will all be able to buy 8K TVs that cost $500-$600. So I think that makes sense. But, obviously, it leaves the content creators to struggle to create 8K content now, right? I'm talking about the Netflixes and, of course, the YouTube creators.
Yes.
Some of them are already shooting in 8K, but they use it for the resolution so that they have a 4K output so they can crop and stuff and zoom and same with some people shoot at 4K just to downsample to 1080 because it gives them more panning and zooming opportunities. Yeah. So I think that I'm not against the idea of 8K. I'm just concerned that 4K seems good enough, and it's probably limited to 30 frames per second at 8K anyway, and you're going to be much more sensitive to transmission speed, storage issues, and processing, right? Like dropped frames are still a thing on 4K phones.
Yeah.
And even on 1080p recording. So I wonder how much of an impact it's going to have. As much as I want to encourage people to create 8K content, this seems to be more of a play of like, hey, we need to sell some QLED TVs,
Well, you will be able to do kind of both on-device trimming and downscaling to lower resolution, like on the phone itself. So I think that will kind of make it you'll be able to choose basically, shoot at the highest resolution possible, assuming you've got the storage for it, and then pick the kind of the best conversion that suits your need. If you're going to be streaming it to an 8K QLED TV, which Samsung is going to make super simple, you just have to tap the phone to the side of the frame of the TV and it will make a casting connection and you can stream it straight across. Or if you're going to upload it, you'll be able to upload directly from the phone to YouTube and, choose whether you want to max out your 5G pipe with an 8K video, or kind of take it down to 4K for something slightly more manageable.
I want to see what your data plan costs are going to be when you do that.
Well, I think that's, Verizon
That's a big
and
unknown right
AT&T.
now.
Yeah, everyone is going to be very pleased, I think, if you make maximum use of that 5G connection in that way. Everyone apart from your bank account. But
you can't say that Samsung's 5G ready, because they are. They're ready to use up all your 5G bandwidth.
Absolutely, yeah. I think actually the 8K, for me, kind of becomes really interesting when you look at something like single take mode.
Right.
I don't know if you had much of a chance to play with that.
I did not. I barely played with the cameras.
Yeah, I think if you know how in Google Photos and Apple Photos, it will take the images and the videos that you've uploaded to automatically, and then sometimes it will just generate something interesting for you.
Right.
It'll make you a photo with a filter maybe, or it'll create a video of something, or make a funny animation of someone falling over or whatever. And it's kind of like a surprise and delight thing. All of a sudden you'll open the app up and there will be something waiting, and some of them are terrible. You think, oh God, why would I want this? And,
Yes.
and others you're like, oh, okay, no, I'll save this. So single take mode is kind of like that, but in real time. So it's a separate mode in the camera app. You switch to it, and then it's kind of like you shoot video for 10 seconds. So you hit the button, you move the phone around. It kind of, if you're not moving it around well enough, it will say, move it around a bit more.
Nudges you.
Yes. And you can't zoom in that mode. It's just literally you point the phone around at the scene. And then as soon as you stop, it automatically creates anything from, so the minimum they say is 2 videos at most full HD resolution. The maximum will be 10 photos and 4 videos. And for the photos, it's doing things like, it's picking out best moment, like when people have their eyes open, if they're smiling. It'll do live focus maybe. It'll do the different filters. It'll maybe crop to pick up what's the most interesting thing in the scene. It'll take video clips and maybe apply filters to that and kind of make loops of them. It'll save obviously the original video as well, and it just basically all of that sensor stuff that we've just spent the past 10-20 minutes talking about, and kind of all these things that pro shooters like you are very excited about, rightly so. It kind of bypasses all of that completely, and it leaves the phone to do that. And single take mode is just saying, okay, well, here's something which, we're giving you a handful of things. Maybe 1 or 2 of them you're going to consider social media sharing ready.
Totally,
and I think I think it's just a really interesting way of doing it. I'm skeptical normally about these kind of filter modes on phones, because normally they're just a bit naff. But I feel like single take mode has the potential to be a little more interesting than that.
No, I feel it's kind of Zoe, but in real time. Remember Zoe from HTC?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
And it's basically a part director, part curator built into your phone using AI. I think it should be interesting. My concern is that it might homogenize the look and feel of people's content, over time.
This is true, but I think that that people have already done a very good job of homogenizing.
Doing that, because they're optimizing for Instagram or whatever, right?
Yeah,
in the
people
same
know
way
what
as
shares well. Yeah.
Artists are optimizing for Spotify in terms of song length and patterns and an art and structure. Yeah, I know. Oh man, we're driven by the machine more and more. In both directions, the machine's driving us and us driving the machines.
I think we just have to embrace the machine.
It's funny. It's interesting. Something to remember when I sit on my rocking chair and yell at the children. But I think we've covered everything on the S20, right? We should talk about pricing real quickly. I know we kind of hinted at it on the Z Flip. $1,380 is the price of the Z Flip. Available tomorrow, the 13th, or the day after?
Valentine's Day, the 14th.
The 14th. So available the 14th of February. I always forget that's Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
Because, I'm so European, I don't really care about that.
There is no love in Europe, yeah.
I know, but I'm like, I haven't lived
Only
in Europe in 30 years or something. You'd think that by now I would be on top of this. These weird North American trends. But
like romance, yeah.
Yes, indeed. In terms of pricing on the S20, $999 for S20, $1199 S20 Plus, and $1399 for the S20 Ultra. It's interesting. There's no phone here that competes with the iPhone 11. Like the S10e last year was kind of at a sweet spot of $750. There is nothing here, and I'm wondering if that's going to be the S20 Lite.
Well, so they're keeping the S10 range on sale.
Right, that's the other thing. They're lowering the price of it. So if you want a headphone jacks, you know what to do.
Yeah, $150 being taken off from February 11th.
But so does Apple, right? They kept the XR around. And so I'm not sure, like, it seems odd to me because I feel like Samsung needs a brand new phone in the S20 lineup that is competing directly with the 11 somehow.
Yeah, I definitely I think that they have left themselves that room to do that, and I wonder if maybe they want to make sure that that is a 5G phone, and so they have to wait a little bit longer in the year for that to become cost effective.
Maybe it should be a Dimensity 800 or 1000 phone, huh? MediaTek?
Maybe, I would be surprised at that. Yes, but yeah, I think that my suspicion is that it is that which is holding up that kind of device.
So let's rapid fire some news items before we wrap up.
Mm-hmm.
They're launching the Mi 10 on the 13th, tomorrow, in China, and then on the 23rd during MWC and the rest of the world globally. And I'm bringing that up because 108 megapixel camera, right?
Yeah. Funny that, isn't it?
I know. And 60 watt wired charging. Are you ready for 60 watt wired charging when your power brick is bigger than your phone?
Yes, I think it's I mean, faster charging is always good, but yeah, you do start to wonder. I mean, back on the Samsung thing, you know, the S20 Ultra supports, what is it, 45 watt fast charging? Though in the box,
it does.
Yeah, though in the box you only get a 25 watt fast charger.
You know
like
who
you
else
do
is
with
doing
the
this? Moto's doing the same thing. Some of their phones support, like they announced as the G series, and some of them support like, you know, 25 watt or something, and then in the box is an 18 watt charger, and you're like,
it's
why?
It's a very good question.
Actually, no, that was the Moto One Hyper. Supports up to 45 watt charging and some really high number. In the box is a 18 watt charger. Wah, wah, wah.
Well, yeah. It's.
I suppose at $300, it's price sensitive, so maybe that's why.
I don't know. Once you're spending $1,400 on a phone, I kind of feel like they could throw in the best possible charger.
They better, right?
Yeah.
But Apple doesn't. Well, for a long time, didn't do that. So.
No, that's true. True.
So this thing has like quad camera. It has Snapdragon 865. I mean, I'll link to a SlashGear kind of recap article that tells you everything you need to know. If you're a big fan of Xiaomi, you should check out the Mi 10. Xiaomi makes great phones for the money. So the big question will be the price on this.
Yes.
Yeah. I expect it to undercut everything else, probably by $500 or something like that. It'll be fascinating. We'll see what happens. And maybe they'll go crazy and make a flagship that costs more.
Maybe.
Who knows? Speaking of flagship phones, another leak that we've seen this last week has been a leak on the LG flagship. There's rumors that there's not going to be a G9 this year, but there's going to be a V60, and we might see that at MWC, and the V60 would be 5G, still have a headphone jack, and apparently a massive battery. So what is your take on that? 5,000 milliamp hours. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem quite so surprising now that, you know, we've seen what the S20 Ultra is going to have. It's clearly not going to be at MWC because while we were talking, the GSMA have decided to cancel the conference. So
wow.
So it will
I knew that was going to happen somehow. It just seemed crazy to me. Wow.
It did, but So, I mean, I would love to have high hopes and expectations for the V60. I really would. I feel like LG's ability to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory is just, you know, always impressive. I'd like them to do, you know, I would like them to make an interesting, competitive, compelling device. But based on their track record of the past few flagships, I'm kind of not exactly hopeful that that's going to be what happens.
Yeah, I think LG is just not getting the love it needs. I feel that their phones are so, in some ways flawed, but in other ways quite good. Like the G8 camera system last year was so underrated. People didn't really even try it. And then when I actually did try it, I was like, whoa, this is solid. Like, you know, we're not talking Pixel here, but we're talking better than the Galaxy, I thought at the time. You know, and I feel like they're not getting really the love they deserve. So I really hope this V60 lives up to, you know, its there's no hype, but there's not going to be hype. It's LG.
No, that's
but
the problem.
It lives up to the expectations of the LG customers. Good cameras, headphone, great audio, and from the looks of it, good battery life. Snapdragon 865. So I'm excited.
Yeah.
This is a developing story, and I think we should jump on it really quickly. You just said MWC got canceled. I just had a quick look, which is why I said the big wow a second ago. And oh my God, WTF.
Yes, I know. I mean, it did seem like it was tumbling head first into that decision because, over the past few days, we've just seen more and more
of cancellations.
Companies just saying,
but I'm wondering what's going to happen next. I mean, I'm still planning to go unless my sponsor pulls my travel and hotel at this point. Because I'm being sponsored there. But my goal is that I feel like there's going to be the few people that remain if Huawei doesn't cancel and Oppo doesn't cancel, etc. We might have some good press conferences that we can focus on, like announcements that are because those are unrelated to MWC. And MWC, you can actually attend an MWC without being officially part of the conference if you're media, because you can get invited to a lot of things that are happening outside of the venue, right?
Right, yeah. That companies know that people are going to be in town for MWC, and so they arrange kind of press conferences and things kind of off-site at different times. And it becomes quite a full week. I'm very curious to see how this happens, how this pans out, because both the public statements and stuff kind of being said privately was that, companies were feeling very cautious about this and not wanting to be involved in a kind of coronavirus related PR nightmare. And it's a lot of money at stake. And it's a very interesting time. I can't imagine that the GSMA, which obviously runs Mobile World Congress, is particularly happy at the moment. But
Wow. I mean, this is a huge deal. I feel like, I don't want to undermine the dangers of this illness, this virus, right? I mean, it's clearly a problem just as much as I feel like, or possibly even more than SARS was in 2003. But we didn't have the internet that we have today in 2003. And I feel that we didn't really know what was going on as well as we do now. And so it's hard to compare SARS to coronavirus. But, pandemics are a thing and we all have to concern ourselves with that and worry about it. I just feel personally that this seems a little bit of an overreaction. I'm not sure how you feel, but I mean, some people say, well, better safe than sorry. But the reality is that life has to go on, right? Like we have to also find a balance here. And I feel like MWC is really so focused and concerned with the potential legal ramifications of what might happen that they're pulling out right now. And also because, obviously a lot of companies have been pulling out. So it's kind of a domino effect, right? But wow, I think this is a bit disappointing. I feel like they should have stuck with it.
I think that it's a rock and a hard place. I think on the one hand, yes, you're right that whilst obviously a serious issue, regular flu has killed a whole lot more people so far this year than coronavirus. And there are still people out there who have not had a flu shot. But at the same time,
you could flu shot, people.
Yes, go and get a flu shot. At the same time, you could argue that it maybe also makes sense to not pull together hundreds of thousands of people from around the world and encourage them to travel and bring them into sort of close contact with each other. I know just,
once they had the initial cancellations of some of the big players, the scope and size reduced enough that the danger reduced as well. So why actually cancel a conference? That's kind of how I feel about it.
Possibly. I don't know. I feel like I think it was always going to be an either or thing. I think that shrinking it down and kind of reducing it was never really going to work. I think that this was. I think that once the first big company started pulling out, I feel like we were always on this trajectory to them cancelling it.
Yeah, the domino had started tipping. Yeah, and we were just watching everything unravel in slow motion at that point, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll find out next week on the show. Stay tuned for next week's show where you'll know if I'm actually going to Barcelona or not, if my sponsor has pulled the plug or not. I hope not. I want my air miles, okay? Like, this is all about my status on my airline, okay? God damn it. Other big news of the week, as we quickly wrap up, is T-Mobile Sprint merger being approved by a federal judge. So it's going to happen. There you go, folks.
It is. And
how do you feel about that, Chris?
Honestly, there are much cleverer people out there who know more about the business side of it. And,
Sasha Segan.
Yes. So, you should definitely go and read whatever Sasha has written about that. I feel like, as someone who uses T-Mobile,
myself included,
I am looking forward to having better coverage in more places. I'm looking forward to having the combined spectrum of Sprint and T-Mobile for them to do 5G. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So,
especially that mid-band that we all need for 5G, right?
Absolutely. And so, I am cautious about the potential for, they have talked a lot about, that this will not lead to higher prices, that there will still be
and customer service,
and customer
quality
service
issues, right? T-Mobile is really good right now.
Yeah, and I would like to think that will. I think they believe that now. Whether they will still believe that 12 months, 24 months down the line, and whether that's still what we're being delivered, I think we'll just have to wait and see on that one.
Especially with the change of regime, John Ledger is leaving.
Yeah.
And so that's my biggest concern. Honestly, I feel that in terms of spectrum and technologies, this is the right move. But I feel that the concern is, of course, customer service and pricing. And T-Mobile has led the way there for years. And I hope and believe they'll continue. The people that John Ledger assembled at T-Mobile to run the show that are taking over are, I think, still very much on board on that. But you know how it is. Business is business. And sometimes things go wrong when competition is different. And we'll see what AT&T and Verizon, which are now the only competitors left, are going to do. So I'm cautiously optimistic as a T-Mobile customer, but I'm also a little apprehensive, I guess.
Yeah, maybe it's because I'm British and cynical, but I think I always felt that that whole Un-carrier putting the customer first thing was primarily because it was so easy, because customer service on the other carriers was generally so bad that this was a really easy way to distinguish yourself in
and
a market.
Also, it's marketing, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And John Ledger is a genius at marketing.
He is, he is a very, he's the CEO's name of a carrier that if you asked most people to name the CEOs of the other carriers, I feel like they would struggle to name them. And so, they have done a really good job of making that kind of their USP.
For sure.
But whether they then still need to do that when all of a sudden they are significantly larger, the cynic in me says there was going to be less of a requirement for them to do that. They'll get away with more. Absolutely.
Last bit of news before we wrap up. MediaTek revealed, actually this is older than a week, but I missed it last week. And I love me some MediaTek every now and then. Competition is healthy. I love my Qualcomm and MediaTek friends, both. Ryan, our friend Ryan at Android Police, one of my colleagues there, wrote a great story about these MediaTek chips. I'll link it in the show notes. Basically, MediaTek launched 2 mid-range smartphone gaming chips. So they're smartphone chip for the mid-range that are gaming optimized, kind of like the G90 chip they did last year, but this is cheaper. So G80 and, it's also a G70, so G80, G70 below the G90. Check it out. There's details on what is involved. These are not 5G chips, but they are going to be very popular in markets that want very cost-effective chips that still pull a pretty solid punch in terms of gaming performance. So it's always good to have competition, and I'll basically leave you guys to do your homework.
It's always nice to be set some homework.
I know, right? Listen, we should wrap up, Chris. It's been really great to have you on again. It's been a little while since I had you on last, but please tell the audience where they can find you on various social media channels and, of course, SlashGear.
So you can find me at C_Davies on Twitter, where I tweet a lot about things. Or you can find me at slashgear.com or at SlashGear on Twitter. These are the places, and I am the man.
That's right. You are the man, and you should follow Chris because he is the man. All right, folks? Yes. You know where to find me on the internet, folks. I'm at Tankgirl. That's TNKGRL on Instagram and on Twitter. Instagram is where you'll find pretty pictures of phones and pretty pictures taken with phones. Once I get my hands on a Samsung S20 Ultra, you'll get those Galaxy 108 megapixel photos. So check that out.
Compressed wonderfully on Instagram, of course.
Indeed, absolutely. Also on Twitter is a good place for you to discuss the podcast with me. There's really no standardized way of commenting on podcasts. So I encourage you to go to your Twitter and rant and rave and talk to me, and we will interact that way. There's also a YouTube channel, Mobile Tech Podcast YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/Mobile Tech Podcast. You can go there to see some complimentary content, videos, mostly unboxing, hands-ons. Like I've got some hands-on videos of the Unpacked event from yesterday. I also have a pair of Galaxy Buds Plus. We didn't talk about them, but they're basically an improvement over last year. Better battery life, better sound. That's basically all you have to know. And I've got them, so I'm going to unbox them for you all. So just check that out. The YouTube channel is a big deal. Extra content for the show. Finally, if you stumble on this podcast and you want to subscribe, you're wondering where is all that good stuff, mobiletechpodcast.com has quick links where you can click and subscribe on your favorite platform. We're on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Cast, Spotify, pretty much everywhere. Just look for Mobile Tech Podcast or my handle Tanker, LTNKGRL, like the comic book character without the vowels. And I want to thank our sponsor, Audible. Audible.com is where it's at. If you like audiobooks, if you like to drive and listen to books, or maybe you like to sit with your eyes closed and give them a rest from reading and listen to a great book, you can do that with Audible. They are the platform for audiobooks. You should check it out, because if you do, there is a deal for you involved here. This is a two-way street. You get a deal, and it supports the podcast. The deal is 30-day free trial. Everybody gets that, but you get to keep the books that you download during that period, even if you cancel. So there's lots of really great opportunity here. You're not married to it. Try it out, and it'll support the podcast no matter what. audibletrial.com/mobiletech is URL. audibletrial.com/mobiletech. I'll have it in the show description, show notes below. Try it out. Support us, help us. Check out the books. They're great. The authors read the books. That's my favorite thing. And I'm about to binge on a massive Star Wars book adaptation of the recent movie. So that should take about 20 hours of listening. That should be good. Yeah, so thanks to Audible, and they've been along for the ride for a while, so I appreciate them being on. And then thanks again, Chris, for being on the show. Much appreciated.
Always a pleasure.
All right, folks, stay tuned. We'll have another show next week, and you'll find out, if you stay tuned, whether I'm actually going to MWC or not, and what else happens in the crazy world of mobile tech. So stay tuned for that, and until then, cheers, everyone.
This has been the Mobile Tech Podcast with Tank Girl, proudly presented by worldpodcasts.com. You can visit us online at mobiletechpodcast.com.